He broke the rules for a woman without a ticket. 24 hours later, his tugboat was being escorted by Coast Guard vessels, and the entire company rewrote the protocol. One passenger too many? On the Cannary River, morning didn't come by the clock, but by sound. First came the soft rustling of water against the concrete supports of the old bridge. Then the horn of a distant tug somewhere around the bend. And finally the creak of the gangway under the weight of the first footsteps. For Captain Nate Hunter, this ritual was more reliable than any alarm clock. He would be on the bridge before the dock came to life, before the phones started ringing, before the loaders arrived, before the dispatchers sent their updates and weather reports. The vessel under his command, Marlin Bell, was far from beautiful, but Nate knew every bolt in her frame. A paddle tug once retired from the Pacific Line, she had spent the last 12 years running inland routes, hauling fuel and modular structures up the Cannary to the regional terminal in Haven Bluff. It was a route he knew by heart. No passengers, no deviations, no surprises. He poured his first cup of coffee into a worn thermos mug bearing a faded Union logo and exhaled into the morning air. The water looked calm but cloudy. The spring flood was stirring up the sand, which meant the current would be strong. The waterfront was empty, except for a dog behind the fence in the maintenance yard and a couple of gulls circling above. Everything seemed in order. Even the wind came from the southwest, the very one Nate called a working wind. He checked the route, the pressure gauges, the winches. The boys blinked steadily on the radar. The crew knew the plan. JD and Ellie were already securing the aft cables, and in 15 minutes they were expected to enter the channel. Everything pointed to a smooth departure. What he didn't know was that, across the river, behind the warehouse awning at the smaller pier, someone was already waiting. A woman stood there with a bag and swollen eyes. She hadn't stepped forward yet, hadn't called out, hadn't said a word. But she, within 24 hours, would change the course of the voyage, his reputation, and the very rules by which he'd lived for the past 15 years. For now, though, it was just another day. With the dawn, the river, and the quiet sense that everything was going according to plan. When Marlin Bell began maneuvering along the freight dock, Nate noticed her almost by accident. She was standing at the old concrete ramp where construction materials used to be loaded, now closed off for repairs. A woman, young, not more than 30, in a dark jacket and sneakers, with a small bag at her feet. Her posture was cautious but not hostile, and she was alone. Against the backdrop of gray metal and still water, her figure looked out of place. Nate was about to look away when he caught a second signal. One hand, free from her bag, rested gently on her stomach. The gesture wasn't sharp, more instinctive, like from discomfort or nausea. The jacket hid the shape of her body, and only a careful glance could catch the fatigue in her movements. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know where she came from or why she was there, but something in that gesture made him stop. While the barges began unloading fuel and JD monitored the pumping station, Nate descended to the lower deck. He didn't rush. He wouldn't even admit to himself why he was going. Maybe just to make sure everything was fine. Maybe to send her away. The rules were clear. Marlin Bell was carrying hazardous cargo. According to every protocol, there wasn't supposed to be a single extra person on board, especially not a civilian. Company policy was strict. It wasn't personal. It was about insurance, logistics, legal liability. Anyone not listed in the manifest was automatically a problem, especially if something went wrong. But as he came closer and she looked up, something in her face softened him. There was no panic, no pressure, just exhaustion. That same look he'd once seen in the mirror 10 years ago when his wife had gone into labor without him. He was on a run then, hauling spare parts in New Orleans, when it started early. He didn't get to her until the next day, and for that entire stretch of time, he hadn't known if they were alive. "Headed to Haven Bluff?" she asked softly. "I need to get there. Urgently." He nodded, almost automatically. He was already imagining how he'd explain this to the lead dispatcher, already hearing the tone from the company. "You knew what you were doing." Of course he did, but he also knew it now. This woman wasn't pretending. She wasn't asking for money or pity, just a route. She handed him a medical statement and a copy of a military clearance. Her husband, it turned out, was a technician stationed at the Haven Bluff Air Force Base, temporarily recalled from field exercises. The note read, gestational age, 29 weeks, condition stable, travel permitted under rest conditions. In her bag, tucked between papers, he noticed a drawing folded in quarters, a child's hand. Hesitant lines. In the corner, a penciled note. See you soon, Mom. On the reverse side, an Army canteen stamped with the emblem of the 42nd Maintenance Wing. Officially, no chance. He was supposed to politely decline, cite the rules, and return to the bridge. But something in her silence, in the way she didn't beg, but simply stood there, made him say only 2 words, step aboard, carefully. He settled her in the spare cabin near the engine room, not the most comfortable spot, but warm. Gave her a thermos with hot water and laid out a blanket. He didn't ask her name. He still hoped this would be just an exception, that the trip would pass quietly and then she'd disappear, and he would go on with his run as if nothing had happened. But maybe that was the whole point, just letting someone get where they needed to go. Sometimes that's enough. The next day, the river looked different. Nate stood at the navigation console and watched the water lose its clarity. The Cannary was always unpredictable in spring, especially after a night of mountain rain. Now the current dragged along broken branches, plastic containers, even a chunk of an old raft that felt like some forgotten past. The flow thickened, viscous, as if the river itself sensed that something was off. The internal radar began dropping individual buoys. Some had shifted, others no longer replied at all. JDD tried to balance the feet on the bow winch, while Ellie reported that pressure in one of the fuel hoses was unstable. Nothing critical, but better not to gamble. A system warning flashed on screen. Pressure irregularity. Check load parameters during turn. Nate dismissed it out of habit. This wasn't his first spring full of surprises. He glanced through the bridge glass. Out on the horizon, the sky was changing tint, first merely darkening, then streaked with blue bands, as though someone had spilled ink above the distant forest. Clear enough, the storm front that was forecast to pass south had veered, and it had come here. Late, but determined. He tested the link to dispatch. Beeps, static, broken phrases, no stable frequency, no clean coordinates, only a fragment. If you reach mile 217, keep an eye on the platform. Repeat, possible drift. That was new. The platforms, long pontoons used to supply repair stations along the shoreline, never drifted. Each carried a locking rig and a backup anchor. But if one of them had torn loose, that was an altogether different story, especially if it was headed down the main channel against the flow in shipping traffic. Nate straightened and studied the current. It was accelerating. Bank to bank, the water rolled in wide sheets, alive. Marlin Bell was towing 3 full barges of aviation fuel, close to 1,000 tons in all. She handled like a whale in a narrow cove. Stopping or turning on this stretch was nearly impossible. If a platform really was drifting, it would be more than an obstacle. It could be a threat. To them, to shoreline structures, to the cargo itself. Ellie stepped into the wheelhouse. Link to River Central is dying. I tried for an updated brief, but they're barely holding the frequency. Confirmation came through, though. 1 pontoon has left its position, and it's roughly on our route. Nate said nothing. He had felt it before he heard it. Inside him, something answered with a dry, precise resonance. Choice, the again. You sure it was smart taking her? JD asked suddenly, eyes never leaving the gauges. If anything happens, we'll be burned first. No manifest, no clearance. You know how that works. Nate didn't answer right away. I know, and you know I wouldn't have done it lightly. Exactly, JD nodded. That's why I'm not arguing, though maybe I should. He tightened his safety belt and added in a lower voice. Only, now we're both in it. Let's hope it's worth it. 30 minutes remained to the fork where the river made a sharp bend and shed speed. If the pontoon really was drifting downstream, collision could happen right there. where there was almost no room to maneuver. Nate glanced at the camera feed. Amy Carter was asleep in her temporary cabin. She was barely visible on the screen, yet he checked the monitor the way one checks cable seams before a winter run. Not just in case, but because now he couldn't do otherwise. He looked at the route, at the numbers, and a thought surfaced. If I turn now, I break schedule. If I don't, I watch something sink. He wasn't showboating. He wasn't looking for excuses. He had simply reached another line past which the regulations fell silent. A sharp call from below. "Captain?" JD's voice from the lower deck. "Something ahead. Looks like a pontoon. No, wait, pipe. Just an old pipe. Floating crosswise." "Copy," Nate replied. He exhaled. A false alarm. But it served as a test. Adrenaline spiked. Tense silence settled in the wheelhouse. It's always in moments like these that nothing happens. Then suddenly everything happens at once. JD's voice returned, a different timbre now. "Nate, if that really is a pontoon, we're blind. Just say so and I'm on it." There was no fear in his tone, only resolve and trust. Nate picked up the mic. "Rig the side cables. We may have an uninvited guest in the channel. We didn't ask for it, but we'll have to greet it." He switched off the autopilot. From here on, it was hand steering only. It didn't happen all at once, not in a single moment, but as a series of small, almost imperceptible deviations, each one by itself not enough to cause alarm. Just a slightly stronger current shift, just a slightly delayed system response, just a slightly earlier awakening, something Amy would later describe as an internal jolt. On the monitor in the wheelhouse, her figure stirred, then sat up. A second later, she was already upright, one hand gripping the edge of the bunk, the other resting on her belly. The camera carried no sound, but Nate could tell from her face. It had begun. He froze. The thought flashed through his head. It can't be. It's too early. She'd said there were still more than 10 weeks to go. He had believed her. But the body, it seemed, had made its own decision. Maybe it was the motion, the stress, the sleepless night. Something had pulled the trigger. He handed the controls to JD, climbed down the narrow ladder, past the engine room, and when he reached the cabin, he saw it with his own eyes. It had truly begun. Amy was breathing slowly, but unevenly. He didn't ask. She whispered it herself. "They're contractions, but it's too soon." He stood there overwhelmed. What was a tugboat captain supposed to do with a non-manifest passenger going into labor in the middle of a river during a storm? The answer was simple. Nothing. She should never have been aboard in the first place. Everything happening now was the result of his mistake, his decision, his break from protocol. My mistake, but now, my responsibility. And still, he said, "I'm here. We'll get through this." He called for Ellie. She'd taken first aid courses in the past. While JD kept the vessel under manual control, Ellie and Nate moved Amy to a safer zone, an old equipment room with vibration dampeners, once used for storing electronics. Not a medical bay, not even close, but better than nothing. Blankets, water, a flashlight, an old army kit left from the days when the tug had run military lines. As Ellie unfolded the med kit and began examining Amy, she said quietly, without looking up, "I once held a woman's hand while she gave birth, during an evacuation. There was a war. I didn't know if she'd survive. You don't forget something like that." She said no more, and didn't have to. There was no drama in her voice, just memory, plain and embedded. Up on the bridge, another kind of battle. The drifting platform had entered visual range. The current was pushing it, sending it sideways across the channel. Wooden siding, rusted chains, no working lights. JD slowed the ship, trying to steer around the mass. But with that kind of weight, one wrong angle could throw a barge off alignment. And that meant thousands of liters of aviation fuel spilling into the river. While Ellie helped Amy and the vessel creep past the obstacle, Nate stepped out onto the outer deck. Through the wind, he saw one of the trailing barges brushing dangerously close to the pontoon. There was a grinding metallic noise, Not a collision, but close enough to send a shiver. And then it happened. Not a disaster, but the kind of mistake that easily could have been. One old clamp, one bad weight shift. That's all it took to send things teetering. Barge number 3 slipped half a meter, disrupting the balance. It was barely noticeable, if not for the storm, the drifting platform, the emergency berth, if not for all of it aligning in that 1 hour, in that one stretch of river. Nate reacted fast. Manual pressure release, load redistribution, emergency braking. The tug slowed. The barges rocked in a wave, one after the other, but they stayed in line. And he returned below, where the air was full of labored breaths and muffled sounds of pain. "She asked me to tell you, her water just broke," Ellie said, shifting the flashlight. He nodded, then sat beside her. Not as captain, as a person, one child, one barge, one mistake, all tangled together in one knot. He remembered that night 10 years ago, when a nurse at the hospital handed him an envelope. Inside was a photo, a newborn, a swaddle, a note from his wife. "You were needed, but you're always near, even when you're far away." And now he was near, even though he shouldn't have been, even though he had broken the rules. The barge leveled out. The platform drifted behind them. The river flowed on as if nothing had happened. But he knew. Everything had changed. And now, there was one more soul aboard. There is no such thing as silence aboard a freight tug, not even at night in the deepest corners of the vessel. The metal breathes, pipes resonate, fuel shifts in the tanks. Everything lives in its own muffled, stubborn rhythm. In the hour when Amy Carter was giving birth, that very hum became the heartbeat to which her son entered the world. The room they had moved her into had never been meant for anything human. It had once held boxes of wire, coils of cable, and spare flashlights long since forgotten. Now it held 2 blankets, a desk lamp casting yellow light, and a thermos that Ellie refilled every 15 minutes. The air felt dry and tense, like before a thunderstorm. But the storm had long been traveling with them. Not outside in the sky, but inside. Inside Amy. Inside the tug. Inside every one of them. Nate was neither doctor nor priest, yet he stayed. He couldn't leave. He sat on an overturned crate, sometimes glancing at the ceiling as though instructions might descend from above, afraid not of failing, but of becoming part of a moment that had no right to happen on his ship. He kept his distance at first. Amy breathed hard but did not scream, clenching the blanket's edge and closing her eyes from time to time. Watching her, the woman he should never have taken aboard, who had asked for nothing but a chance to arrive, he finally almost timidly reached out. She took his hand without words or thanks, simply because it felt right. Exhausted as she was, something in her eyes held him there. Ellie worked with steady precision. Her emergency birth training dated back 10 years, but muscle memory proved stronger than doubt. Gloves, medkit, clean sheets, everything gathered in haste seemed inadequate. Yet it was enough. In moments like these, the material hardly matters. What matters is that the world does not turn away. On the bridge, JD labored twice as hard. Ever since the drifting platform incident, the control system had glitched, and he had to adjust cable pressure by hand. Waves grew steeper, as if the Cannary River were testing the tug's worthiness. At 3:41 a.m., a thin cry rose, faint, almost lost, yet clear. Metal bulkheads carried the sound through every deck like ripples across still water. Ellie exhaled, straightened, and said, "A boy. He's fine." For the first time that night, Nate felt he could breathe. He stepped closer and saw the dark-haired newborn curled in a blanket against Amy's chest. She looked up. No words, no request. Only a look of thanks that needed no reply. Nate thought that if someone walked in then with regulations and a clipboard, he wouldn't explain or justify. He would simply stand between and say, "The child is here. Everything else can wait." An hour later, after Amy had fallen asleep, Ellie checked pulse, breathing, blood loss, all within safe limits. "They need a hospital," she said, "but for now, everything's stable." Nate returned to the wheelhouse. Dawn was pushing the mist away, revealing the first outlines of Haven Bluff. Airfield towers and metal hangars stirring to life. He sounded 2 short blasts, an old naval habit no one required, but one he believed was proper. A child had been born in motion, no place in the manifest, no insurance, no formal clearance. Yet he reminded everyone aboard that the voyage's purpose was not the cargo, but that those aboard arrived alive. Coursey steady, speed needle leveling, water smooth ahead, the shore lay close. Nate left the bridge, walked the echoing corridor, and stopped outside the temporary cabin door. He didn't enter, just leaned against the bulkhead, exhaled, and closed his eyes. Outside, the rain had started again. By midday the next day, the storm was gone. Only puddles remained, scattered debris and broken branches near the Haven Bluff dock. The station looked tired, like a person who had made it through a sleepless night. Workers in yellow vests were back to hauling crates, forklifts whined, and the docks buzzed with routine. Everything moved as it was supposed to, as if nothing had happened. But for the crew of the Marlin Bell, everything was different. Nate stood in the doorway of the Port Authority's captain's office, with Ellie just behind him. She held the baby in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket with the station's logo. Amy sat on the old couch, pale but composed. Her shoulders were square. No complaints, no requests. The reception area was quieter than usual. No one joked, no one offered coffee, because everyone already knew. It was a small town. The port, smaller still. The summons had come in that morning. Captain Barrows, you are requested to appear and give an explanation regarding deviation from route, violation of cargo transport protocol, and the unauthorized presence of a civilian aboard the vessel. It was signed personally by Major Reed Hallman, chief of the Coastal Inspection Board, a former sailor, director, stern. Nate knew this was going to be a short conversation, and not in his favor. When he entered the office, Hallman didn't stand. He simply nodded toward a chair. Sit. I read the report, he said. At first I thought it was a logging error, but then the bridge crew confirmed it. Passenger not listed in the manifest. A barge nearly shifted. And you, the captain, delivered an infant like it was a fishing trip. Nate said nothing, just exhaled. Not from fear, from fatigue. Hallman didn't raise his voice. You know what this means? Just that alone. Grounds to revoke your license. Add a civilian complaint. Potential legal action under overreach of authority with risk to a federal logistics unit. He paused, then stood and walked to the window, gazing out at something far beyond the horizon. I once took a fisherman's family aboard, he said quietly. His daughter got burned. Thermo locker leaked. We were the closest vessel. I lost my bonus, caught a formal reprimand, but I saved the kid. Still wonder if it was worth it. He turned back toward Nate. You didn't just save a woman and a child. You got your vessel through a cyclone, held the tow line, avoided collision, and, this is key, stabilized a drifting platform that no one else took responsibility for. The system glitched. You responded manually. There's no medal for that, but there is a difference. He walked back to his desk, pulled out a folder, signed a form, and handed it to Nate. So, official reprimand. It'll go in your file. No bonus, no recognition, but no charges either. Nate accepted the paper without a word. At that moment, Ellie appeared in the doorway. She stood calmly, holding the baby a little closer. So that's the plan, she said. But the child, he's not a mistake, and we both know it. Hallman looked at her, then back at Nate. His voice softened. You did something you didn't have to, and I won't forget that. Nate stood. He bowed, not by regulation, but as a man. When he stepped out into the hallway, sunlight spilled through the corridor windows. Amy was holding the baby herself now. He slept, his face nestled into her shoulder. Ellie leaned against the wall and gave Nate a look. Well? Reprimand, he said. She only nodded. Along the dock, people had begun to turn their heads. Someone approached. Someone clapped a hand on his shoulder. Someone said, I heard you, but he didn't stop. What he had done didn't feel like a hero's act. It was a decision and a reprimand. But he knew, if it came to it again, he would do it the same way. Because sometimes life moves faster than the rules. The return trip down the Cannary was always the quietest stretch of the journey. Empty barges no longer dragged the propeller, the water lost its push, and the engines hummed at half power. That evening, Marlin Bell moved light, and for the first time in 48 hours, Nate Hunter allowed himself to switch off the internal autopilot of worry. The official reprimand remained locked away in the station's safe, taking with it a portion of his pay and a new line in his personnel file. But on deck, it smelled like freedom, and something new, still unnamed. Indigo twilight rippled across the surface of the river when a signal flared on the radar. At first, Nate thought it was a fishing boat. Small signature, moderate speed. But within a minute, the dot became a shape. A Coast Guard cutter, flat and fast, with distinct blue strobe lights. It approached head-on, then turned and came alongside the tug. Close, but not confrontational. The radio came alive with a calm, measured voice. Marlin Bell, Captain Hunter, acknowledging rendezvous. Maintain current course. Nate glanced at JD, who was squinting at the screen. I don't think this is a scheduled patrol, JD murmured. Wrong sector, wrong time. Nate said nothing. He just steadied the helm. Seconds later, another voice came through the radio. Different now, more personal. Captain, this is Lieutenant Josh Carter. My wife and son made it. That's enough. He didn't identify himself by protocol, didn't mention rank, just human. A short horn blast came from the cutter. Not ceremonial, not formal, just a signal, the kind that doesn't need an explanation. Nate exhaled but found no words. He simply turned the wheel slightly in acknowledgement. Course confirmed. By then, the lights along the Haven Bluff waterfront had begun to glow. People noticed the unusual pairing, the tug and the cutter moving side by side, synchronized. Someone waved from the dock. Someone filmed on a phone. But the moment wasn't festive, just attentive, quiet, the kind of silence that speaks louder than trumpets. Amy appeared on the upper deck, holding her baby, carefully, confidently. She stood at the railing and looked out over the river, the cutter alongside them, the glow of the navigation lights. Then she said softly, I didn't think I'd make it, but now I think he would have come anyway, just not like this. Nate turned to her but didn't speak. He knew he didn't need to. Just before reaching the port entrance, the cutter began to fall back. The radio spoke one last time. Marlin Bell, this time, we'll let it go. Next time, follow the weather and your gut. Out. The blue lights flicked off, and the cutter turned toward its dock. The tug continued toward mooring. And in that moment, Nate realized the engine noise, the slap of water, even the scent of machine oil. None of it felt like routine anymore. Now it was the echo of that one night when he broke the rules and saved more than a shipment. He cut the engines, stepped out onto the deck, and leaned against the rail. In the pocket of his uniform, the copy of the reprimand still sat folded, but the paper suddenly felt weightless, like a dry autumn leaf. The river reflected the last streaks of sunset, and Marlin Bell's steady keel caught their shimmer, like something no one ashore would ever notice, but someone aboard would never forget. The cutter disappeared around the bend, but the ripples it left behind still spread across the water. A quiet reminder that sometimes the right decision begins with the words, even if it's not aloud. In the wheelhouse of Marlin Bell, just above the old compass and behind the route charts, there is a metal locker, the place for paper logbooks, laminated instructions, and the spare flashlight. On its door, wedged between a faded Union stamp and pencil marks from years past, a narrow plate of matte aluminum is fastened by two small screws. It was cut and stamped by hand. In March 2024, this vessel left on one route and returned with something not listed in the manifest. One person, one decision, and one voice that cried out for the first time in the hum of the engine. Marlin Bell, Captain N. Hunter. No superlatives, just a fact understood by those who were there. The plaque is not on any inventory sheet, and passengers never notice it, but now and then a crew member lets a gaze linger on those lines. A month after the voyage, the company amended its regulations. In exceptional circumstances, a captain may take an unregistered passenger aboard if life is in danger, provided dispatch is notified within 24 hours. The protocol remained, only now with a caveat, and wherever a caveat appears, personal responsibility begins. One day JD, folding away a chart, looked at the plaque and laughed. You always said plaques were only for heroes. Nate, standing by the porthole, answered, "That's not a plaque. It's just a reminder." The tug kept to its schedule. JD at the helm, Ellie in the engine room. Amy and her child stayed in town. Now and then, Nate saw them near the hospital or at a cafe and simply nodded if their eyes met. Once a month, he wiped the plaque free of dust himself. No words, not for inspections. The papers sit in archives, reminders travel with you. The vessel still ran on time, but for those who had been aboard, nothing moved strictly by the book anymore. Sometimes stories don't need applause. They need only a nail, a piece of wood, and the people who one day will slow their steps, read and think, so it can happen after all.